this morning, right? If you're not angry, maybe you're not paying attention, right? It feels like there's something to this anger. And so anger has been on my mind because it's been on all of our minds because we're living in a cultural moment in which anger is having a moment. And I want to be fully honest with you that even if we weren't living in such an angry moment, anger would need to be on my mind right now. And that is true, I am sure, for some of you, and I'm sure it is not true for others of you. By which I mean I am a person, individually, who is prone to anger. Unlike Rabbi Orenstein of blessed memory, I am the sort of parent who, let's say when my child leaves something on the floor that I asked them 3 times to pick up, and then I hurt my foot on that thing they left on the floor, I am not the one who says, oh, child, what did you do? No, I sometimes let my rage out. And by sometimes, I mean far, far, far too often. So I don't want to pretend that this is only a topic of interest to me because of this moment that we're all living through. Like some, but not all of you, I am a person who's prone to anger, and I've been struggling with that and working with that for years now. I'm trying to figure out, what do I do with it? Where does that come from? How do I sort of manage that anger? And those two angers, the anger of the cultural moment and the anger of those of us who are by nature angry people, are not as separate as we might want them to be. By which I mean, I sometimes think to myself, well, when I'm parenting, I do lose my temper with my child. Yeah, there's definitely negative aspects to that. And maybe there's something powerful to that as well. Right? Maybe there's a way in which a child learns something when they see how intense I get, how passionate I get, and maybe gets a message across in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. And conversely, maybe when we think about our anger in the political realm, the activist realm being positive or even righteous, maybe that's a cover for just wanting to give in to our anger, right? So both of these angers, this personal one that to me at least initially seems so obviously problematic, maybe it's not entirely problematic, and this other anger that at least in many circles is getting glorified, well, maybe it's not so worthy of that glory. So what I want to do with you tonight is learn Jewish sources that help us think about anger in its various manifestations. There are more sources here than we will have time to get to, but it is my hope that we'll get through a good chunk of them, and we will get a chance to sort of see different attitudes towards anger in the Jewish tradition, the rabbinic tradition in particular. So let's start on page 1 of your source sheets. Hopefully everyone has one of these packets. And we're going to start with just 3 sources that are typical and emblematic of the classical rabbinic approach to anger. When I say classical rabbinic, I'm talking about texts from the 2nd through 7th centuries CE, texts like the Talmud, or the 2 Talmuds really, the Mishnah, and we are going to see 3 texts from that corpus. I could have given you probably 50, right? That all say the same thing: anger is bad. So if you didn't get enough sleep yet today, you can tune out for the next 5 minutes and just remember that anger is bad. If you want to see what the sources actually say, we'll see them inside. Source number 1, Amar Rabbi Eli, Bishlosha Dvarim Adam Nikah. A person is recognizable, you know a person's true nature, through 3 things: Bekoso, Uvekiso, Uvekaso. There's the lovely alliteration and assonance as well. Through their cup, through their purse, and through their anger. Which would seem to mean when a person gets drunk, that tells us something about who they really are. How a person spends their money. Some of us are big talkers about tzedakah, but don't actually give tzedakah. Look, case in point, right? And how they are in their anger, right? Those are the 3 things that really tell you who a person is. And the implication seems to be, in your anger, you reveal what kind of person you truly are. And some say, actually, there's a 4th thing, which is how a person laughs. A nice addition. I want us to have it in our minds. But for our purposes, what's clear here is that the rabbis are already saying there's something about anger that sort of weakens you, sort of reveals who you really are in a way that has a bit of a negative undertone. If that's not clear enough, let's see this next one, source number 2, also from the Talmud, from a different tractate of the Talmud. Shlosha Hadash Baruch Hu Oavam. There are 3 kinds of people who the blessed holiness, whom God loves. Now I should say, this must mean especially ones, because we know from our tradition that God loves every single human being. So what do we mean? There are 3 people who are especially worthy of God's admiration and love. Who are they? Micha'el Koes, someone who does not get angry. Umishe'eno mishtaker, and someone who does not get drunk. Umishe'eno ma'amin al midosav, and someone who does not, this is actually a hard phrase to translate, but it seems to mean something like does not stubbornly demand their honor. Someone who is willing to relent when something is owed to them in the realm of honor, and they're willing to sort of let it go. And then a little bit later on the same page, Hanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, Shlosha Chayehem Einam Chayim. There are three kinds of people who their life, it doesn't even count as life. There's something so wrong with what they're doing that's like they're wasting their lives. What is that? Harachmanin, those who are presumably overly merciful, though literally just means the merciful ones. Varaskanin, those who are boiling, that is to say, those who are prone to anger. The Ganine Hadas, and the delicate. The Amar Rav Yosef, Kulu Isnu Bi. And Rav Yosef, this rabbinic sage, says, by the way, all three of those I've got, right? I have all three of these problems that make your life rough. So already we see some sensitivity to this. We could have a whole lecture on what does it mean that the merciful, their lives are not really lives? What does it mean that the delicate, their lives are not really lives? But for our purposes, what I want you to notice is, if you are someone who's prone to anger, the way I described myself about 5 minutes ago, according to this early rabbinic teaching, then your life is not worth living. There's something horrible about this. So he has a really clear sense that anger is a terrible thing. And Rabbi Yosef tells you, yeah, it's a terrible thing, but even I, Rabbi Yosef, a rabbi who made it into the Talmud, even I struggle with this issue. So we have some sympathy for it, but it's clearly a rough situation. Finally, Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonasan, the English there is a typo, say Yonatan, not Yochanan. Rabbi Yonatan said, Kol HaKoes, Kol Mine Gehinim Sholtin Bo. Anyone who gets angry, and by the way, I forgot to say in the past one, who does God love? Not someone who's slow to anger, not someone who rarely gets angry, but someone who doesn't get angry. And here also, anyone who gets angry, and the implication seems to be ever, all manners of Gehenna, that is to say, of hell, rule over them. There's a ... here because I wasn't sure how proper the crowd would be, but I will say the continuation, which I deleted because I was too bashful, that anyone who gets angry will get hemorrhoids. Do with that what you will, but the point is it's bad, right? It is really bad to get angry. If you get angry, you are not in the category of people that God especially loves. Your life is not worth living, and all manner of hell will rule over you, and you'll have some medical issues as well. So this is typical. I could give you a 2-hour-long lecture that would get extremely boring very quickly, just telling you over and over again in different metaphors how bad anger is. But I want to know, this is 95% of what the classical rabbinic corpus has to say about anger is along the lines of what we're seeing here. And so it's not surprising that when we turn the page, both literally and metaphorically, literally in our packets, metaphorically in terms of time period, going from the classical rabbinic period of the Talmud to the medieval period in Rambam, Maimonides, it's not surprising, based on the hundreds of statements I could have given you about how bad anger is in the Talmud, that the Rambam says like this, source number 4, V'yesh deos she'asur lo l'adam linhog behen b'beinonis, ela yisrachek min hakatzeh ha'achad ad hakatzeh ha'acher. There are certain personality traits which it is forbidden for a person to act with them in an intermediate way, to be moderate. The context here is that the Rambam, some of you probably are aware, is well known in Jewish thought for saying that a person should try to be moderate in all things. Don't be overly happy, don't be overly sad. Don't be overly generous, don't be overly cheap. Do everything in the middle. If you know Greek philosophy better than you know the Rambam, this might sound familiar to you from Aristotle, golden mean. Right? Rambam was a student, not literally, but through his books, of Aristotle, and he invoked one should always be medium in every personality trait. But here, he says, even though I just told you there should be medium, moderate in every personality trait, there are certain things, actually he's going to say 2 things, where you should not be moderate, where you should absolutely go to the other extreme. The first one is, V'hu gova lev. The first one is arrogance, ... Arrogance is a trait. I left that out because that's not our topic tonight. That one should not try to be somewhat arrogant and not completely unarrogant, but rather you should be completely shafel, completely laying yourself low, completely humble, make yourself a zero. That could be an interesting lecture also. I don't want to actually suggest that I think that's right, but that's one thing the Rambam says. And then, continuing the second paragraph in both the English and the Hebrew, source number 4, V'hen hakas. Mida rahi ad lama'od. Also, anger is a trait that is truly, extremely, very evil. And And it's appropriate for a person to distance themselves from anger to the far opposite end, the total other extreme. And a person should teach oneself. You should train yourself. Listen to the language here. So you don't get angry, even over something that is appropriate to get angry about. Right? The Rambam's not saying, be so zen that you just sort of don't think anything is actually angry. No, you can recognize this thing that's going on right now. It actually is angry. It's ra'ui. It's appropriate to get angry over it. Nonetheless, a person, says the Rambam, should train themselves so that even when something that's objectively angering happens, don't get angry. That's the Rambam's language. Amru Chachamim Rishonim, the early sages said, Kol HaKoes im Chachamhu Chochmaso Misalekas Mimenu, V'im Navihu Nevuaso Misalekas Mimenu. Here the Rambam quotes one of those other Talmudic passages that I could have brought you, but cut out for the sake of time and boredom. He says, the early sages say, anyone who gets angry, if they are a sage, their sagacity will depart from them. They will no longer be wise. And if they are a prophet, their prophecy will depart from them. Their prophecy they'll no longer be a prophet. You cannot be a wise person or a prophet if you are an angry person. Anger causes those traits to disappear. Uvalekas ein chayehem chayim. And people who are angry, their lives are not lives. That's quoting the passage we saw, source number 3. Leficha, therefore, therefore, they commanded, the sages of the Talmud commanded, that a person should distance themselves from anger, so much so that you don't even feel. Ad shelo yargish. This is going to be very important later, right? It's not just that I control my anger, right? It's one thing to sort of do sort of cognitive behavioral therapy type things, and get to a point where it's like, okay, I feel the anger, but I train myself, so I'm not going to show my anger, right? No, this is the Rambam. You have to get to a point where you don't even feel the anger anymore. Even for things that are angering. This is, look, the Rambam was never a person who had low standards. This is an incredibly high bar, right? He takes these passages that we've seen in earlier Rabbinic sources, and he says, yeah, anger, I'm going to step out of my normal rule, which is be moderate in all of your traits. Anger is one exception, one of 2 exceptions, where you should be a complete zero anger, not 50%, 0%. And I want to point out, this is actually really striking, because not only is the Rambam departing from his own principle that one should generally be moderate in all of your traits, he's actually departing from the version of that principle that he learned from Aristotle, his teacher. Because Aristotle actually says, a person should be moderate in all of their traits, including anger, right? Even when it comes to anger, says Aristotle, you should not be an angry person, but you should also not be so devoid of emotion that you never get angry. There are times when it's actually valuable to get angry, says Aristotle. And there were Greek philosophers at the time, the Stoics, who, like Rambam, said, no, you should never get angry. And so Rambam, who normally follows his Rebbe, Aristotle, in saying that one should always be moderate, here he says, no, I'm going to depart from Aristotle in 2 ways, both that you should not be moderate in this one example, and even anger, which Aristotle himself thought you should be moderate about, no, we're going to get rid of that. So for the Rambam, we take all these rabbinic passages, and we take them to the extreme and say one should not even feel anger, even when something is angering. Let's pause here for questions not yet come. So we'll come to comments soon. Any questions up until this point? Okay. So let's, we got one.
Those of us old enough to remember this, it was a famous moment in a presidential debate when Dukakis was asked, what would you do if you were raped, went to get it? And the basically was unangry, unmoved, and that sort of was a commentary on his attitude of life.
Yeah. Great. What's your name?
Bill.
Bill. I'm so glad Bill raised that. Can folks on Zoom hear, or should I repeat it? Begin here. Okay, great. So I'm glad you raised that. I hadn't thought about that. By the way, if you're not old enough to remember that, but you are old enough to remember the West Wing, there was an episode that sort of clearly is paralleling that actual real world event. And I want to come back to that. I'm going to see a source later from a modern philosopher that I think really gets that Dukakis/Jed Bartlett moment. So I want to come back to that when we get to Srinivas later. Great. Okay, so let's move forward. We've seen that anger is terrible. We've seen that the Rambam codifies this as like the thing we should avoid entirely. Let's think with classical rabbinic sources about why anger might be terrible. So source number 5, this is a source that I imagine some of you have seen before, a Mishnah from Pirkei Avos. Hu Haya Omer, Hillel would say, Ein bor yarechet, a bore, someone unlearned, cannot be a sin-fearer. Again, there's so many things here that could be their own lecture. We're putting that off to the side. Velo am haaretz chasid, a commoner cannot be a pious person. Velo a baishan lamed, and a bashful person cannot learn. I quote this regularly to my students. If you have questions, you don't ask them, you're not going to learn. So a bashful person cannot learn. Velo a kaptan milamed, and a kapdan, which could be translated in several ways, but one plausible way is translated as an angry person, and we'll see the next source understands it that way, so we'll go with that. An angry person cannot teach. So Mishnah Avos tells us, if you are by nature an angry person, you cannot teach. I told you already that I'm an angry person by nature. I make my living teaching, so that's why I'm in therapy. Okay, so let's see what source number 6, the Orchos Tzadikim, does with this. The Orchos Tzadikim is a fascinating work, 15th century Germany, anonymous. We don't know who wrote it, but he goes through different personality traits, and he tells you both the positives and the negatives of each trait. And so we're going to see 2 passages from the Orchos Tzadikim, sources 6 and 7, on anger. So this is from this passage on Shar HaKas, on anger. Amru Rabboseinu, our rabbis taught, Lo kapdan melamed, an angry person cannot teach. Why? Ki meirov ka'aso hatalmidim yarein mimenu lish'os bekosehem peyichos alehem. Because since the teacher is so angry, the students will be fearful to ask the teacher their questions. I have a question, I don't want to ask it because I'm scared the teacher will yell at me. I imagine I've seen some nods. You've all had someone like, I won't say my teacher's name from 7th grade, let's keep watching. But Mr. So-and-so, who like no one asked a question. You were all scared. They were going to yell at you saying, how come you don't understand it yet? Why don't you get this yet? If you are an angry person, you discourage questions. So one reason that anger is bad is that it discourages conversation. If I yell at you every time you ask something, you're going to stop asking things and then no one will learn. Even if they do have the courage to ask, despite the fact that I'm an angry person, the person will not have sufficient mindset to actually explain properly to their students. And the teacher will respond in an angry way, and as a result, they won't understand. When I'm angry, I'm not at my sharpest. I am not as clear when I'm angry. So my anger discourages my students from asking their questions. My anger prevents me from being clear. And this last bit, I could just be the second thing said a different way. Or perhaps what it means is, even if you ask me something, and even if I explain it clearly, but in a loud and yelling, angry voice, you're going to be so distracted by my anger that you won't actually understand what I'm telling you. And so the learning process is disrupted by anger. So a couple different reasons we see that anger is bad. It discourages conversation, it prevents clarity, and it prevents understanding. One possibility for what's wrong with anger. Source number 7, the same author, just a little bit later in the passage. You see people. When they are angry and they are holding on to their anger, they don't pay attention to what they're doing. They do things in their anger that they wouldn't do if they weren't angry. Another West Wing reference, the very first episode, Jed Bartlett rides his bike into a tree because he's angry about something, right? And if you're watching that episode, it resonates because we've all done that, right? We've all, maybe not ridden your bike into a tree, we've all done something stupid because we were in a fit of anger. And therefore, if you're not thinking straight when you're angry, an angry person will necessarily transgress. They will do sins because you're not going to be thinking about what's the right way to act. You're going to be not thinking at all. You're going to be in your state of anger. Hakaz mevatel kavanas leiv hadam betfila vein shchina shora mitot hakas. And if you're trying to daven and you're angry, you're trying to pray, you're trying to talk to God, but you're in a state of anger, you can't pray. You can't have mindset. You can't have kavanah when you are angry. Adam sheyesh bo midas hakas umachriach es midaso uminhago kilu eno mibalei hakas kilu eno mibalei hakas alav ne'amar tov erech hapayim v'gibor umoshel berucho meloked ir. And then he goes on to say that if you actually are an angry person and you're able to control it, you're able to sort of hold back and not be such an angry person, that is the greatest kind of gvura, the greatest kind of heroism you can imagine. What is it to be a gibor? It's able to control your anger. So this second Orchos time, similar to the first, but I think a little bit different, right? It's focused on the fact that when you're angry, how many of you have stubbed your toe when you were angry because you weren't paying attention to where you were going, right? And all the more so, you make bad decisions. So we're discouraging conversation, we're losing clarity, we're losing understanding, and we're losing our ability to think clearly and make good decisions when we are angry. All very good reasons why I would say, and the rabbinic tradition does say, anger is bad, and our job should be to avoid anger entirely. One more source, this one we're going to jump ahead about 1,500 years to the early 20th century. One more source talking about why anger is bad. The Shem Yishmuel is an early 20th century Polish Hasidic Rebbe, the second Sokotover Rebbe, Rebbe I've been spending a lot of time with in recent years. And he says something that I think is amazing. Trying to explain what's wrong with anger. He says, "V'hine kas hu hamafrid hipu hadas." Right? Anger is the separator, it's the mafrid, it's the thing that creates distance between two people, which is the opposite of knowledge. Right? How do I get knowledge? How do I get wisdom? I get wisdom from interacting with people, right? And the Shem Yishmuel will say, not just from interacting with people, but interacting with God, right? My interactions with you and my interactions with God, that's where my wisdom comes from. Right? No one becomes intelligent in a vacuum. We become intelligent through our interactions with other people. So if anger is a separator, it's going to prevent knowledge. In this way, you can understand the words of a passage in the Talmud that we did not see in the Talmud, but we did see the Rambam allude to it. Kol HaKoes, anyone who gets angry, if you are a wise person, your wisdom will depart from you. If you are a prophet, your prophecy, your ability to prophesy will depart from you. Because Jewish wisdom comes from connection to God. And I'm going to add here, I think based on my understanding of Shem Yishmuel elsewhere, that he would say this also, but to be fair, he does not say it here. Interactions in general, right? Being in communication with God, being in communication with each other, that's where our wisdom comes from. The Nabi, what is prophecy? A prophet is so in tune with God's will, with the Kadosh Baruch Hu's will, that they get prophecy. But if you're angry, you can't be in tune with anyone's will. Because you feel, when you're angry, you don't feel like connecting to anyone. You want to go to your room and close the door and binge something. Probably the West Wing, based on what I've been thinking about. All right. And that's why anger drives away wisdom and promise. We can't be connected when we're angry. If we are not connected, we have no wisdom. So anger, the mechanism by which it sort of shuts us down is that separation it creates between us and others. So a variety of different reasons why one might think anger is bad, mostly from medieval and early modern tradition. Pause here for questions and comments. Yeah, just say your name. Sherry, thank you.
From the therapist's point of view, I think to help you get there are many instances where suppressing your anger is not good. And from my own experience, especially in circumstances of bereavement and great loss, anger is a very big part of that. But you're not supposed to be angry, particularly at the person who wants, but you are. And not expressing that leads to a lot of dysfunction and sometimes prolonged mourning. So rather, if you can acknowledge it, talk it through. I see the next one showing you anger about the big things. In my practice, that's what you should be angry about, but you should be able to talk through.
Right. So we're going to come back to that. Hopefully, if we have time, I'll make sure we get to the source that deals on that.
If you don't mind repeating the question, they can hear.
Yeah. So the comment was about that often in therapy and in life in general, we see that constraining one's anger is not healthy. It actually prevents us from processing it. Beautiful. Thank you, Sherry. Are there other hands that were up? Yeah, and what's her name? Say it again.
Bert,
Bert.
and we're talking about anger, you mean just the normal sense, or the rabbi talking in some special sense?
Wish they would tell me. All the anger. Are they about anger that like children are starving? Or are they about anger that a child left Lego on the carpet? Right? I don't know. So I assume that all of it. And the truth is, part of what I'm coming to, I'm not sure I believe what I'm about to say, but it's where I'm sitting currently, that I think the gap between the anger I feel at a kid who uses a Lego on the carpet and the anger I feel at injustice in the world, they're not as different as I would like, I think. And I want to come back to that later. And I think maybe the fact that the rabbis aren't distinguishing reflects that. But I'm not sure I believe what I just said. It's just where I'm sitting right now. Okay, let's keep moving forward. So we've seen anger is bad. We've seen a bunch of reasons why anger is bad. But as Sherry just alluded to, I mean, Sherry didn't quite say this. I'm going to twist your words to get to where I want to go for the moment. We'll come back to what you actually said later. But there's a sense that sometimes anger can be good, right? And when you have in source number 10, it's not actually a source, it's a URL you can go to when you get home and click on that link and see a whole summary of 10 different experiments that were done to test the effect of anger on effectiveness. And what they discovered in these 10 different experiments, that anger makes you better at doing hard and complex tasks. It does not make you better at doing simple tasks. But when something is more difficult, for example, one of the studies showed that people had more persistence when they were angry. I want to stick it to you, so I want to make sure I get it. So I won't give up as easily if I'm angry. So that's one of the ways in which anger can actually make you more effective, right? We just saw, oh, anger makes you less effective. Well, sometimes your anger does drive you. Think about like the basketball player who like got posterized, like someone dumped on them, and now the next time down the court, they're gonna like really play well because they really want to prove it that they actually are better than their player. There's an amazing moment in the summary of the studies where it talks about one of the studies showed that if you're angry, you're more likely to cheat, and cheating will make you more effective. And the authors of the study, they're like, we want anger to happen. We don't think that cheating is a good thing, but it does make you more effective. So there's all these things that sort of show that anger can make you more effective. And we don't have to sort of go to those studies, right? We know that people have a sense that that's the case. Especially since the 1960s and the civil rights movement, there's been a sense that sometimes your anger can be liberatory. That actually you can use your anger to sort of show people the injustice in the world and thereby transform the world in a way that if you were maybe a little bit calmer, you wouldn't be able to get across. And in the 60s, there were intense debates, both within the civil rights movement and between civil rights movement activists and folks who were less supportive of civil rights. Intense debates about the usefulness of anger, with some folks saying, you know what, I understand why you're angry, but your anger is not helping your cause because you're turning people away, right? When you fight for justice with an angry tone, you set your cause back. And other people saying, no, 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 our anger actually sets the cause forward because it actually gets clear how serious things are. And that is a debate that goes back, as I already alluded to Aristotle and the Stoics. The Stoics say, anger is always counterproductive, never get angry. Aristotle says, no, sometimes anger is actually productive. So that's a debate that goes on and on. And the question is, do we see any sense in Jewish sources, right? The Jewish sources that are so negative on anger, but we have this sense both from our own experience and from experimental studies and from philosophy. We have the sense that sometimes anger can be good. Is there anything in the Jewish tradition who says, yes, it could be good? And shockingly, you know where we're going to find it? The Rambam. Remember the Rambam said, anger is the worst thing on earth. You can never be angry, not moderate. It's got to be 0, no anger whatsoever. But look at source number 11, which is literally one chapter before source number 4. Right? Source number 4, he says, anger is the worst thing on earth. That's chapter 2. Chapter 1, he says like this. Haderech hayeshara imida beinonis. The right way in general is to be in the middle. Shebechol de'avidea. Mikol adeos sheyesh lo ladam. For every trait, be in the middle. V'yadea she'yirachok mishtei katsavos. And that is the trait that is equidistant from the two extremes. It's all a long way of saying gotta be in the middle. Therefore, the sages, the early sages decreed that a person should continually evaluate, estimate their traits, and evaluate them, and move yourself to the middle. So you should think to yourself, am I a person who's generally optimistic? Well, then I should try to train myself to be a little bit more pessimistic. Am I a person who's a little generally pessimistic? Then I should train myself to be a little more optimistic. I want to find my way to the middle for every possible trait. Ketzad, how so? What's an example of being in the middle? Lo yehei bal chema, noach lichos. A person should not be an angry person who easily gets angered. V'lo kames she'eno margish. And not like, as my grandmother plus memory would say, not like a dedvan, right? Who doesn't feel anything, right? Ella benoni, rather you should be in the middle. Lo yichos ella al davar gadol sharui lichos alam. One should get angry only for something that is truly worth getting angry over, ra'ui, appropriate to get angry over. Such that the thing that happened that was truly angering will not happen again. The Rambam comes along and says, first of all, I want to note the language of don't be like a dead one. That goes back to, say your name again? Bill. Bill's Dukakis, right? The Rambam would say, yeah, Dukakis in that moment, he was like a dead one. He wasn't feeling anything. And that's not good either. Right? You gotta be in the middle. But the problem is, this is the very same Rambam, merely one chapter apart, who just told me I should never get angry at all. I should not feel anger. And if, just to sort of highlight it, source number 12 is just those two Rambams put side by side. And you can see the language is almost exactly the same, except it's the opposite. One should not get angry, even for something that's appropriate to get angry over. One should only get angry for a big thing that's appropriate to get angry over. Right? There could not be a more striking contradiction in the Rambam. And the Rambam, in my opinion, had many flaws. But inconsistency and bad editing was not one of them. Right? He is a very careful writer. So something is going on here. I'm going to do one more so that we'll take questions and comments. So something's going on here with the Rambam, where on the one hand, he says anger should be a complete zero. No, there are times it's actually good to be angry. And unless you think this is a mistake on the Rambam's part, source number 13, you're not going to like this one. I don't like this one either, but it's for the full integrity, you should read it. A student, sometimes you're in class, it's like all my classmates got this thing right away, and I don't understand it. And if you're like me, your tendency is like, well, everyone else understood it, so I'm just going to pretend like I got it too, right? And the Rabbi says, don't be like that. Because if you do that, you're going to go to the study hall, the base medrash every day. It's a waste of time. You're not going to learn anything. So no matter how many times it takes you to learn it, you got to keep asking the teacher until you understand, even if everyone else in the room got it already. Right? It's an important caveat. That's why they said an impassioned person can't learn. And an angry person cannot teach. But when does that apply? That's true when you're teaching and your students don't get it because you're teaching them multivariable calculus, something that's really difficult, right? Then you shouldn't get angry with them. Or when you're teaching students who aren't that bright, right? It's not a complicated subject, but your students just happen not to be that bright. Don't get angry with them. Aval, imni karla rav shem misrachlim b'divrei Torah. Oh, it's clear to the teacher that the material is not that difficult, and they are bright. And the reason why they're not getting it is because they're being lazy. Right? They're sort of being casual about it. And that's why they didn't understand. The teacher is obligated to get angry with them. How do we resolve the Rambam? So I'll take questions or comments or attempts to resolve the Rambam. I've got Rabbi Alissi and what's her name? Rabbi Alissi and Misha.
Well, we should all yearn to have sort of moral clarity and have clear distinction between what is right and wrong, and there's things about us that we would define according to Rambam as Jabbar got told. Big deal to be angry over. I wonder if there's still a little bit of subjectivity in that, right? Because that which is a big deal to me may be something that somebody else doesn't care about. So I think I'm justified in my anger, but somebody else may be totally apathetic to the reason, to the same idea.
Great, say one more sentence. Are you saying that as a sort of way to resolve the Rambam or as sort of kind of?
Wondering if he addresses the subjectivity of that idea.
Yeah.
What is a big thing?
I wish he did, right? And like, you might notice that in the second passage where he says you should get angry over something, he actually adds the word gadol, right? Which some commentators try to use as a way to resolve this. Oh, you should only get angry over a big thing that's worth getting angry over, but not a regular thing that's worth getting angry over. And then subjectively, what is the big thing, right? But the problem is, he doesn't say in the first source, never get angry except for a big thing. You never get angry. So it's even, first of all, we have, like for the Rambam, it's not subjective. Well, I can't say that, right? Because the Rambam contradicts himself. For the first Rambam, it's also before, it's not subjective. It doesn't matter what it is. Don't get angry. But the second Rambam, exactly, right? At what point do I know it's a big thing and that's worth getting angry over? Great question that I wish the Rambam addressed.
And then I only wonder, right, you look at one of the first texts from the second Sahim, where Rabbi Yosef is acknowledging, hey, something we should do, but I'm not a person, I get it all the time. Is it also a way for Rambam that potentially, the same way Rabbi Yosef did say, hey, I'm acknowledging my own faults, I'm saying we shouldn't do this, but there are times when even I do this, I want to be justified when I do.
I will say from the way the Rambam writes in his response, hard to believe that he was not an angry person. I have to say that, like, I have a colleague who says we all teach the Torah that we most need, right? There's a reason why I began by telling you that I'm an angry person and I teach a lot of Torah about anger. And there I wouldn't say the Rambam's a hypocrite. Say maybe the Rambam is working through something in the same way that, Lahav is not the same, but like, then I'm also working through something. Share. Sorry, Micha'el.
Two things. Early on, like in the Hadar, we are supposed to be angry at the Russia, but also then it is wrong on the 13 acts.
Oh, well, do say more what you mean. There's, yeah.
So the anger.
So that's already in the Torah itself.
It doesn't say doesn't make angry. Well, then.
Yeah. And I will say some of the commentators point out that even in the Mishnah itself, there's a contradiction that sometimes we say things like, God is happy if you never get angry. And in Pirkei Avos, there's a passage where it says someone who's slow to anger that's a good trait. So there's a little bit of fuzziness there that I left out in the sake of time. But yeah, there's some question of like, are we saying you should be slow to anger or never get angry? And the second Rambam seems to be more like the slow to anger. But the first Rambam would be never get angry. And somehow the same author, one chapter apart in the same book, wrote these two contradictory things. Yeah, Mr. Jim? Sure.
I think if the Rambam, one of those Rambam was living today, they'd be very angry.
I mean, I think, like I said before, I actually think the Rambam is an angry person. You get that sense from the way he writes. Whatever, maybe that's my own insecurity, feeling like I'm being yelled at all the time. But yeah, I think he would be angry, but I think he would say to you, it's my job to work on that so that I don't. Yeah.
Is there a possibility that there was a difference in his age when he wrote one versus when he wrote the other?
Great. So sometimes the Rambam contradicts himself between two works. His commentary in the Mishnah he wrote when he was 17 years old. What did you do when you were 17? And the Mishnah Torah wrote much later in his life. So often there are contradictions between the commentary on the Mishnah and his code of law, and those can be resolved by saying he changed his mind over time. That actually happens a lot. But here, it's the same book. He wrote it at the same time.
Which is when he wrote those things.
Yeah, the commentary of the Mishnah, I know he was 17. I forget how old he was when he wrote this, but it was later in life. Yeah, and both of these passages come from the same later in life book. Yeah.
Steve, what bothers me is they talk about the speed of anger, but anger seems to be one level. There are different levels of anger, and they don't seem to differentiate that. If you stub your toe a little bit, you're a bit angry. If you break it, you're really angry.
Yeah. No, so we don't know what the anger is directed at. We don't know what kind of anger it is. We don't know how much anger it is, and all of that is ambiguities. Again, if you actually are living in this model that most of rabbinic literature and that first Rambam is getting at, which is that you never get angry, none of that matters. Because I shouldn't get a little angry, I shouldn't get a lot angry. I shouldn't get righteously angry, and I shouldn't get pettily angry, right? So, but there's this other model where it's unclear what's going on. Now, what I want to point out, yeah,
It seems to me also, Lorraine, that the result or the advice is that, it's all right to get angry, to prod your students who are negligent in their studies to do better. That's acceptable anger, but, you cannot be angry about what's going on around you in your neighborhood or in the outside world. They're kicking you here and there. I mean, he lived in very difficult times. It would be more natural to be angry than not.
yeah, and I think in source number 11, we do get the sense that he's saying not just for anger at students, but also anger at davar gadol shira'ui lichosan, the big thing that's worth getting angry over. But again, that contradicts what he said in the first one. So we're looking at sort of, we're stuck here. Last comment, I'll need to move forward.
None of this helped, but I remember that the Dalai Lama actually, who spends, I don't know how many hours a day meditating, partly to bring that kind of calmness that you would need to feel. I mean, there's a technique toward eliminating. I mean, saying it is one thing, but how do you actually diminish that anger? Said that under certain circumstances, particularly like when the Chinese are trying to push you off and all of your people off a cliff, you do need to fight back. And what's the emotion that's necessary in order for you to do that? So somehow, even somebody like that was able to hold this contradiction, this paradoxical kind of.
Yeah. Now, I will say that part of what we're seeing here is coming up implicitly in many of these comments, and I want to make it explicit here, that this entire conversation has been about, is anger useful? Does it accomplish more good than evil? And I mentioned before that the debate in the civil rights movement and beyond the civil rights movement about, is your anger liberatory? It wasn't a debate about whether anger is ipso facto morally good or bad. It was a debate about, is anger going to set the cause forward or back? And some of those thinkers were saying, you're going to set the cause back, right? You're right to be angry, but if you show it, you're going to set the cause back. And others saying, no, it's actually going to push the cause forward. The Rambam also seems to be operating fully in a sort of efficiency model, right? Even where he says anger could be good, it's good because it will get your students studying something, or it'll be good because it'll prevent that bad thing from happening again. So all of these texts seem to be operating with the assumption that our question about anger and whether our anger can ever be righteous is about the question of, is anger useful? Is it productive? Or is it destructive? Right? And when people disagree about that, that's an argument about sort of real world effects. There's another way to think about anger, which I only came to through this amazing article, source number 15, Amya Srinivasan is professor of philosophy at Cambridge University. That article, you just have a few selections from here. The Atlas of Anger, 2018. I will say, if you go and find this article, there are things in there that, depending on your politics, you will either find beautiful or appalling. But I've selected the part that I think is more on sort of abstract thinking about anger here. And Srinivasan writes, this debate about whether anger is good in the civil rights movement tends to obscure something significant about anger. There is more to anger, normatively speaking, than its effects. Even if anger is counterproductive, we can still ask, is it the fitting response to the way the world is? Is it, in other words, apt, right? Even if my anger won't do anything good, even if it will set the cause back, but my anger is an apt description of the world, maybe that makes my anger in some way good or righteous. When is someone's anger apt? Consider the difference between anger and another similarly negative emotion, disappointment. What makes anger intelligible as anger and distinct from mere disappointment is that anger presents its object as involving a moral violation, not just a violation of how one wishes things were, but a violation of how things ought to be. If I just stub my toe, I'm upset, I'm frustrated. I'm not angry. If I hit my toe on the Lego that my kid left out after I told him 3 times to clean it up, now I'm angry because that Lego shouldn't have been there, right? There's a violation of the moral order. And that is very small, but something was not the way it was supposed to be, as opposed to just bad luck, right? Bad luck makes you sad, injustice makes you angry. What sort of value does an apt response have? So sort of awesome, she asks, okay, so I can say that anger is apt. Why is that a good thing? Why should apt anger be valued? I want to suggest that getting angry is a means of affectively registering or appreciating the injustice of the world. most analogous perhaps to our capacity for aesthetic appreciation. Just as appreciating the beautiful or the sublime has a value distinct from the value of knowing that something is beautiful or sublime, there's a value of appreciating the injustice of the world for one's act anger. You go to the art museum, and like, you could be like, oh, well, I appreciate the dimensions of this painting, and I see that they use colors this way, I don't know anything about art, but you know what I mean? Or you can be like, that thing is beautiful. And she's saying, there's something valuable, there's something good about just seeing a work of art and saying it is beautiful, even without analyzing all the rational bits that went into it. And likewise, she says, there's something about seeing injustice of the world and not just naming it analytically, but actually feeling an emotional response to that injustice that is good, separate from being able to name the injustice. Imagine a person, here come back to the Dukakis again. Imagine a person who does everything as it were by the ethical book, forming all the correct moral beliefs and acting in accordance with all her moral duties, but who is left entirely cold by injustice, feeling nothing in response to the moral wrongs of which she is perfectly aware. I don't want to say such a person has done anything wrong, but I think it's natural to think there's something missing in her. Right? If you look at a world where children are starving, and you say, oh, that's not how it's supposed to be. I will give as much of my money to tzedakah as I can, and I will do as much work as I can volunteering, do all the right things, and just sort of say it in this calm way. And you're not upset about the fact that in a world with so much plenty, there are people starving. If you're not upset about that, there's something, again, I'm not sure I can articulate why that's bad if you're actually doing all the right things. I'm not sure that Srina Vasan can really articulate why that's bad, but I think most, if not all, of the sense that there's something off about it, right? There's something, I want to say almost inhuman, about not feeling anger at an injustice in the world. So that's Srina Vasan. That's not a Jewish source. As far as I know, she's not a Jewish person. She's not a Jewish thinker. But I think we get one brief moment in the Talmud saying something like this, that anger should be valued not only based on its usefulness and its utility, but also based on its aptness and how it describes the world as moral or immoral. We're not going to do the source inside, source number 16, it's a very complicated Talmudic source. Even for those of you who think Talmud is normally hard, this is especially hard, source number 16. It's a source about tearing on Shabbos, and when I'm held accountable for tearing on Shabbos, and when I'm not. If I tear my clothes in a fit of rage, is that, there's no question that's forbidden, but is it forbidden to the point where I'm actually punished for it? Or is it a lower level violation where I don't get punished for it? And the key distinction here is it productive? Because on Shabbos, we're supposed to abstain for productive labor. So if tearing my clothes in anger is productive, then it's worse on Shabbos, and I will get punished for it. But if it's destructive, I shouldn't have done it, but there's no punishment for it. And Rabbi Abed, this is the last line of source number 16, comes along and says, "Han nami misakin." Tearing your clothes in a fit of rage is in fact productive. Why? Because you give pleasure to your yetzer. Right? Now, yetzer in Hebrew means inclination. It is always short for yetzer hara, the evil inclination. So when you tear your anger, right, you did something, I got me so upset, I ripped my clothes. And doing that, I'm giving pleasure to my yetzer hara, my evil inclination. Why might that be a good thing? It's a strange thing to say, right? Like, you would think it would not be good to give supper to your yetzer hara. Yes, Sherry? Okay, so first of all, let's go back to what Sherry was saying before, right? Maybe it's letting it out. Now, that's true, and I think there's a way which is getting that across, except the problem is the formulation is off. Because I'm not getting, to let it out is not getting suckered to my yetzer hara. That's actually freeing me from my yetzer hara, right? So there's something still off about this. Say louder.
It's a day of complete, Shabbat is a day of complete pleasure, or, yeah, so by doing this, you're, I don't know.
Okay, so there's something about the venting that's positive.
Yeah.
Great, and then the hand back there, yeah.
Sure. But if you didn't give acknowledgement to your anger, you might do something worse. You might go after a person.
Okay, great. So one possibility of saying this is I give pleasure to my yetzer hara, and therefore my yetzer hara is like satisfied. Right? Like I threw a steak to the mad dog, and now the mad dog won't attack someone else. Right? So really that was good. Now the problem with this is, as I said, it's a weird thing to say that it's a good thing to give pleasure to your yetzer hara. Even if we can explain it. There's a very common phrase in rabbinic literature that sounds almost exactly the same as this, but is not the same. Not nachas ruach liyitzra, pleasure to your yetzer, but nachas ruach liyotzra, giving pleasure to your creator, who is yotzer you. That's a phrase that appears several times throughout rabbinic literature. And if you look at source number 18, what you have in source number 18 is the exact same line we just had, just from a medieval manuscript of the Talmud, right? So remember, the Talmud was not always printed. We did not always have a printing press. You had scribes who would copy the Talmud down. And in one of the many, many manuscripts that we have of this text, so I want to be clear, there's just one of the many, right? We have actually, you can play to your creator, and the vav in yotzra, that O sound, is crossed out. I try to get this across in English by writing creator and then crossing it out and writing inclination, right? Because the original scribe here wrote, you can play to your creator, and then say, oh no, it's actually got to be your Yetzer Hara. There's something in this initial thought, though, which says that when I get angry, I give pleasure to my creator. Why would God be happy when I get angry? And I think it's got to be something like what Ravasana is saying, right? That God wants us not just to be utilitarian automatons who like analyze everything and say, oh yes, this painting is nice because of these dimensions, but can actually appreciate the painting as beautiful. And when we see injustice in the world, we don't simply say, oh, how can we remedy this wrong? But we actually feel something. We actually feel some amount of anger. And so I think this is the one moment, and I want to be clear, it's in one minority manuscript, the one passage of the Sea of Talmud. I think it's the one moment where we get something like what Ravasana is saying, which is that anger, even if it's not efficacious, even when it's not useful, can actually be powerful and even good. Now, I want to end with just two things to think about. What I'm trying to raise here is the possibility that anger, which should generally be considered bad, right? The rabbinic tradition, I think, is clear. Minastam, our default position, anger is a bad thing. The Rambam is more famous for saying that you should be a total zero on anger than for saying it should be in the middle. And I'll suggest, by the way, one way to sort of resolve that Rambam, right? Which I'm not sure is the right way. There are lots of attempts to resolve that contradiction in the Rambam, none of which is fully satisfying. So I'm going to offer you one. I think what the Rambam is saying is there are times when anger actually is actually productive and therefore good. And even when it is necessary and therefore good, it takes a toll on your soul, right? Even when the right thing to do in a given moment is to feel anger and express anger, you're still somehow negatively affected by that as a person who gets angry. And therefore, we should be extremely cautious about when we're going to be angry. And maybe what the Rambam was getting across is like, you should, but you shouldn't, right? Both those things are true. I want to end with two passages, one, both from sort of the Hasidic world. This first one, number 19, is from the Piazetzner Rebbe. This to me feels like, Hasidic Rebbe sort of intuiting certain aspects of modern therapy. He does like this. Sometimes you eat too much. And because you ate too much, you get sort of hard-hearted and stubborn. Musar lo yishma, and you won't listen to reason. You get arrogant. And you don't even realize that the reason you're in such a bad mood is that you overate. You don't get it, right? You're not paying attention. Sometimes you get angry over something and you don't know why you're angry. You just know you're in a bad mood. You know you're short-tempered. And it's because of something that happened to you earlier, right? Something physical happened, or you were shown disrespect in some way, maybe an hour ago, maybe 2 days ago, and it's been lingering in you. And that's why you're in such a bad mood. You forgot the thing that actually led you astray. But it's still working on you to make you angry. Therefore, the advice is the situation. You should start thinking about, so when did I start feeling short-tempered? When did I start feeling angry? Work back through your day. Maybe work back through the last week. Maybe work back through this last years of whatever it is you're working. And you keep going back. Min shaza, from this moment, when you figure out when did my anger problem come to the fore? And what happened in that moment that might have been the sort of cause, that might have created, as it were, this part of me that's an angry part. And actually, the thing is, I'm going to stop reading inside here. I was just right at the point you go back, and he said, if you go back and you figure out, oh, it's this thing, and as a result of figuring out what it was, you feel your anger kind of melting away. Like, oh, you know what? Now for kids, talking about sort of silly things, I would say, right? Like you stubbed your toe. Oh, right, so I stubbed my toe. That's why I'm snapping at my kids. It's not that my kids are being bad. It's that I stubbed my toe and I'm sort of still lingering in that anger, right? Or maybe it's no, I actually experienced some trauma when I was 10 years old. And that's what's sort of been causing me to deal with my anger issues, right? Whatever it is, you get that point. And he says, I don't think it quite works like this in quite a magical way, but I do think it works in a sort of more substantive way. You start to figure out like, okay, so what's going on? And you start to feel that anger start to dissolve. You realize what was the cause. And I want to suggest, the PSS doesn't say exactly what I'm about to say, but I think he implies it, that when you get to that moment and you really figure out like, okay, yeah, like my anger just comes from this thing that happened a day ago, 10 years ago, whatever it may be, but I'm still feeling this anger in this other direction. That might be one way to think about, is my anger justified? When I've actually done the work, working back through my own experiences, whether they be petty and small or actual trauma, when I work back and I still feel that anger, maybe what's going on is like, that's actually a davar gadol shelo ilichos. That's that thing that the Rambam said is so big, it's actually worth getting angry about. I'll just end with this passage from, it's a story about the Burka Rebbe, told by Rebbe Pegatorsky, who has a sort of online presence. And she writes that the Burka Rebbe, when he needed to get angry, he would robe himself in a special cloak for presenting himself in an angry mode. So he knew that there was someone who done something wrong, and he knew that he needed not just to show anger, but to feel anger. He would stop and pause and put on his angry robe, and only then would he do it, right? They're kind of similar to, there's some 20th century authorities who say if you're driving someone to the hospital on Shabbos, which you're allowed to do, right? Because if they need to go to the hospital, you're allowed to drive on Shabbos. But if you do it, some authorities say you should put your talis on when you do it, right? Drive, let's say your spouse, God forbid, has to go to the hospital, you put on your talis and you drive your spouse to the hospital. So it's clear to you and anyone who sees you, I'm not just breaking Shabbos, I'm doing this religious act. I'm making a choice, a deliberate act, right? And the Vorga Rebbe here, I think it's a similar thing, right? I'm not just being angry because it feels good to vent my anger. What I'm doing is making a deliberate choice. I'm taking the time to say, does this thing rise to the level of the anger I need to feel? Am I doing it deliberately? That's not to say am I doing it coldly, right? But am I doing it deliberately? And I think that, both the PSS sort of investigate our past and sort of get to the point of like, is my anger coming from a trauma I experienced, or is it coming from a place of no, there's actually something truly worth being angry about here? And the sense that actually we can slow ourselves down and say, how can I be deliberate about it? Make sure I make a good choice and not just letting myself go. That I think is maybe the best guidance I know from Jewish tradition or otherwise for thinking about whether our anger is in fact righteous. Thank you everyone for your attention. We have time for some questions and comments. Great. Let's start with Viva.
He did a lot of anger, but I was curious how often I used to burn can you put on the angry coat? And then he
Question is how often you put on this nothing?
the base level will be 9.
Yeah.
And then you strategically make a choice, and now you kind of fall for name.
Yeah.
But it only works if you're not baseline.
Correct. That is a super important point, excellent point. And like, I think that's again, it's getting back to the context of the Rambam, right? Again, my reading of the Rambam, which has problems, but my reading is there are times when you should get angry, but it takes a toll, and therefore I don't want to live my life in civility. I don't want to be at baseline angry. Yeah.
Jonathan, it seems like none of these sources focus on episodes of God being angry in Torah. I guess I was wondering, are there any sages comment on that, or can you comment on that, and how does that fall in terms of positive and negative?
Yeah, I mean, what I would want to see is what I'm saying. Of course, we get angry. We're supposed to be like God, right? We're imitatio Dei, the Jewish value. God gets angry all the time in the Torah, so we should get angry. I don't know of a text that says that. And to the contrary, we see all these rabbinic sources saying, never get angry. It's like they've not read the Torah. They have. So I don't know what's going on. I mean, like, there's some kind of deliberate. And by the way, Moshe also, not just God, Moshe is a pretty angry fellow. The most humble fellow, but also pretty angry. So clearly we have role models. And by the way, the prophets, have you heard of them? Like, they're also not the nicest, calmest people on earth. So there's something going on here, and I don't know quite what to do with it. I always get asked this question, and I remain, in search of a classical text. I think there are modern texts that sort of deal with this question, but they're in terms of classical texts that says like, oh yeah, how can Amos scream and scream about how terrible people are, but we are never supposed to get angry? I haven't seen that addressed. Yeah, I started back there.
You recommend in contemporary thinkers, and that would reflect the Jewish point of view. How to deal with
Contemporary thinkers. You're saying the 7th century doesn't count as contemporary? The 7th century does not count as contemporary? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I will say, I find myself, sort of react, the Jewish point of view, like hopefully what we've seen here tonight, that even on anger, where there's a very dominant Jewish point of view, but even there, even within the Rambam, within one Jewish author, there are multiple points of view. So in general, I think that's just always important to remember that, like, when someone tells you like, oh, so-and-so gets across the Jewish view on X, like, yeah, there's getting more diverse in that. That's not to say that like it's a free for all. And I think, what I hope gets across tonight is, yeah, anger is something we should strenuously try to avoid. There are some views that say we should completely avoid it, and others that say it should be minimized. In terms of contemporary thinkers, I'm stalling because I don't really do anything past the early 20th century. I don't know. If Rabbi Lifty had a suggestion.
You keep going there, it's working.
And Aaron Sorkin makes me angry, actually.
to parents. They talked about when things are out of whack, when the world isn't working right. Parents who have lost a child, their response is total anger upon God, medical establishment, the work. And you have to help them work through that. What would a rabbi say? Yeah. The world is not working.
So I'll say two cognitive things. One is a story that I heard, I forget about a fairly no longer alive, 20th century Rosh Yeshiva, who was called to be a shiva called to a student who had lost a baby. And like everyone's sort of waiting for the Rosh Yeshiva to come in, offer words of wisdom. And the Rosh Yeshiva comes in and just sits next to the student and just puts his head on the student's shoulder and just cries with him. Right? Because like anything I'm going to say that Rosh Yeshiva would have said would be totally, insufficient.
It's acknowledging that this horrible thing has happened. The anger is okay. You've been empathic.
I will to contradict that and say something about it. I just saw yesterday, which is why it's not these sources, I just came across yesterday, in the Izbitzer Rebbe, the Meir Shila, who was a late 19th century Polish Rebbe. He talks about why does God, I won't get into the sort of technical details if we get there, but he basically says that there are sort of 3 levels of piety, right? The lowest level of piety, to think that the world is happenstance. And if you think that the world is happenstance, well, then you're never going to get angry at God when bad things happen, right? If you play the lottery twice a week, right? Play the lottery twice a week, and you never win. You're not angry that you didn't win, because it's just happenstance. It's just luck, right? There's no expectation that you should win the lottery every single month, right? Never mind basketball teams that lost the NBA draft, lottery draft. Right? That's just random. That's the lowest level. The next level is like, no, you actually believe that God runs the world. God actually has, and if that's the case, then you're likely to get angry because you see that the world is not what it should be. Now he then says, like, the highest level is to realize that God does everything for our own good, and we should go see that. And different people will disagree about whether that's the theology you want to have. I disagree with myself about whether that's the theology I want to have. But what I think is powerful about this Izbitzer Rebbe text is that he's saying to be angry at God over something that happens like that is actually a kind of piety. Because recognizing that if you thought the world were random, you would just be sad, you wouldn't be angry. So I think that anger is actually a kind of recognition of like, yeah, there's an injustice here. Rabbi Warner.
I just thought of one person, I was thinking about sort of the Musar movement, and I think there's probably a lot within Musar to study about anger and managing as we that, being slow to anger, and I just thought of Alan Moranis, one contemporary writer. But there are others who sort of make Musar accessible, and like, Everyday Holiness is one of his books, and he was just someone who came to mind. But I was just thinking, in light of some of the questions, it feels like are out of step with the Torah, out of step with the prophets, out of step with reality, and are really simplistic in their thinking. And yeah, and I'm surprised by their. I mean, I'm not.
Yeah.
It's not really.
So may I gently interrogate you and say, given that you have a good relationship with Hadar and generally trust them, and here you're finding yourself saying like, I'm surprised they're overly simplistic. What speculate? Like what might push them to say something that normally they're so sophisticated and complex, here they're so simplistic, why might that be?
Why might they be so simplistic here?
Like in this one area, yeah.
That's exactly my question. Yeah.
Let's ask in the room. Like, why might people who are generally super nuanced when it comes to anger all of a sudden? I think there are. I said 95% of passages are like the ones I showed you. I mean, 5% are a little more sympathetic to anger, but generally, yeah.
What piece is the discussion never talks about, I mean, these are emotions, right? They come up. It's not like where we think about, oh, should I get angry? Should I not get angry? You don't get it. And so it seems kind of pointless to argue whether it's worth it to get angry or not. The guy is angry, right? So I know that there is, generally some discussion about, the emotions and whether like, or you're on certain holidays, you're supposed to be happy. Well, are you happy? Or you're like, how, there's this idea that we maybe, shifting our thinking will change whether we get angry or whether we become happy. But yeah, I mean, maybe that's the sort of assumption that this idea that we can mold when we control when we get angry. But otherwise, yeah, I would expect to have more, oh, hey, when the person gets angry, they should take a ice water bath, or, some remedy to it, because there doesn't seem to be this idea, or just a discussion about like feelings are something that sort of take over rather than people. And the question, instead of whether you should get angry or not, is what should you do? What behavior?
Right,
I
Margaret.
was gonna say, to maybe be a little more respectful, I do think the Mishnah of Ezehu Gibor Hakovesha Yitzro, who is a hero, one who controlled their Yetzer, I think that's a very sophisticated and wise statement. Maybe the rabbis are this way because they see the great power and sort of danger of anger in a unique way, and the importance of needing to channel it, which I think the Torah also recognizes in terms of sacrifices and how do we channel our deep emotions, ritually. So maybe the rabbis also have a special concern about our anger's potential.
I think that's right. I again, we're speculating here, right? Rabbi Martyr and I can't know, but I think again, and part of this is colored by my own experience. I struggle so much with anger; it looms so large in my life that like I'm drawn to these extremist texts about anger in a way that I'm not drawn to extremist texts normally. So maybe that's what's going. Yeah.
And maybe one reason for the extremism here is the comparison that you didn't bring in some of these texts, but that exists in other big texts of that anger is like idolatry. It's a form of self-worship.
Yeah.
How, and anything that touches idolatry suddenly becomes extremely toxic and you have to exercise extreme caution. But I also really like Zeller Lincoln's writing. He wrote a big book on anger. It's a lovely summarizing some sources and writing. I think it's a good book. But I think these days, I also think the one source that people relate to as being resonant emotionally on anger is the source that says, don't talk to a person in the hour of your anger. That, so being kind of, again, the sense of like anger is a flashpoint and a dangerous one. And both from the point of view of the person who gets angry and the person who's around the anger, you have to exercise extreme caution.
Yeah, disconnection.
Yeah, I'll also say that idolatry piece that Rabbi Orenstein is raising, is actually in source number 16 in the ellipsis, it appears there. One version, there are a couple different versions of that in rabbinic literature. So if you want it, you just go online and search for Shabbat 105b, you'll see one version of what Rabbi Orenstein is referencing there. And it's interesting, the slightly different version of that tradition, it's unclear, is it that anger is an act of self-worth, and that's why it's idolatry? Is it an act of wearing down your self-discipline? And it's not that it's idolatry, but it will lead to idolatry. There's actually a little bit of ambiguity there about what's going on, and it's actually really fascinating. In a longer version, we're doing this as a multi-lecture series. We would sink more deeply into that. So I recommend, the whole Talmud is online in English now. I recommend following up on. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. So regarding, why people wouldn't have more nuance, maybe it's that idolatry, or maybe it's that it's something that, it's like a third rail, it's something that's hard to explore because you feel bad about it, so it's staying, you're shut down, so just a thought. And like, reference number 6, you can't think when you're angry, so how can you examine it? But then it also, this whole topic about how to make it useful is the idea of, what's the opposite of, love is not hate, it's apathy, or is that, am I saying that right?
That's right.
And so it's the idea that, it's better to be passionate, even if it's impure or, wrong in some ways, than to not be passionate at all.
I see 2 more hands up. So 1, 2, and then I think we have to call it a night. I'm gonna not respond to make sure everyone gets their chance to say it. So yeah.
Maybe his goal is encapsulated in Rob Joseph. All spirit found in me. Okay, and that was great intellectual conversation, but
Yeah.
we all had it.
Yeah. Not respond. Okay.
I think one of the things that this all comes down to, what you're saying, is that we're very fearful of the power of anger. And we're fearful of it in us, because when I really feel most out of control. We're very, very anger. And that may be one of the reasons the rabbis didn't really touch it that much, because it's almost God-like power takes over that person. The person is actually not the person that they may always be. They're in the throes of anger. And, the person who's angry, the person who's being angry toward is very to see somebody, and we fear it. We fear it.
And that is a frightening and appropriate way to end. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosenberg, for that wonderful viewer. Thank you to the Orenstein family for sponsoring this lecture. And Aviva, do you want to say something in closing?
No, thank everybody for coming, and if you know somebody you can meet, thank you, if that's the way you want to recommend it.